Affirmative Action Annihilated. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and while I realize that it's a bit self-aggrandizing to title my own video with something so rather clickbaity, I'm gonna do so anyway because I have been wanting to make a video about this for months, and I think I have some pretty undeniably solid arguments. I chose today to make this video after I listened to Sargon of Akkad's debate with Thomas Smith last night while I was playing video games, as it was an absolute train wreck. Though Sargon had some great moments, he did really drop the ball, in my opinion, when it came to the part where they discussed affirmative action. As constructive criticism for Sargon, and to anybody who might enter into a debate with anybody ever, I want to remind people that if somebody that you are debating frames an issue in a way that is demonstrably false as a way to make a subsequent point, you need to stop the flow of conversation, go back and correct the inaccurate notion that they presented immediately before it goes any further. Otherwise, somebody can put a false idea onto the table and then continue to try to make a point based around that false idea. And even if their point is bad anyway, and you can refute it, by first not acknowledging that their framing was invalid, you have allowed them to control the narrative with falsehoods. Sargon allowed this to happen when Thomas Smith made the claim that the only thing that people who advocate for affirmative action really want is for there to be preferential treatment towards minorities in the case of an absolute tie in qualifications for admissions to university or hiring somebody for a job. Sargon went on to try to argue against that notion by itself, which there is definitely an argument to be made for, but what he should have certainly done, and I'm sure he knows this by now, was to demand a full stop and say, bullshit. That is not what the proponents of affirmative action want. They want much more than that, and we know this in the current year. I'll explain. First off, the premise doesn't really make a whole bunch of sense by itself. This idea that there's legitimately a significant percentage of absolute ties between applicants to anything is rather ludicrous, as it is an extremely rare occurrence that people have the exact same SAT scores, grades, extracurricular activities, or job qualifications as each other. But even further than that, we bloody well know that affirmative action has gone far beyond this absolute tie sort of a thing. Because if the institutions that use such models of diversity inclusion in their admissions and hiring weren't taking it a step further, then they wouldn't be penalizing Asian people in Ivy League university admissions, which even the New York Times has admitted is a problem. There are literally minorities that are being penalized by affirmative action quotas, probably not just at universities, because for whatever reason, that minority group, despite being one of the most drastically numerically underrepresented groups in the United States, also happens to be really smart and high achieving on average. So they are overrepresented in desirable positions in society. So, what about that? How do you explain that affirmative action is somehow still an even vaguely meritocratic system that is based around cases of supposed absolute ties when we know that people who do well get shafted even if they are minorities? Full stop. The premise Thomas Smith presented is simply untrue, though he'd probably have an answer. But, well, Asians are model minorities and commit less crimes statistically, so they are probably favored by employers and admissions offices naturally, so that's why they penalize them. And maybe that's a bad thing and it's unfair, because Asians do face discrimination in other areas, so I guess that might be why affirmative action is illegal in many places. like in California. So I guess you got your anti-diversity wish, huh? Well, no, Strawman Thomas, things wouldn't be so simple. Just because affirmative action is supposed to be illegal does not mean it doesn't happen. I mean, with social justice activist groups and the blogosphere constantly complaining about companies and universities that lack their preferred diversity, inspiring massive online bullying campaigns and huge protests if they feel that some company or university isn't diverse enough, then we know that there is a major motivation for these organizations to try to be diverse, even if they have to achieve it with illegal hiring and admission quotas. James Damore of the leaked Google document has testified that he attended secret meetings about diversity where they talked about implementing preferential hiring quotas at the company, which of course wasn't documented because these quotas are illegal in California. But again, that doesn't mean they don't happen, because companies are under massive pressure to have a diverse appearance. And of course, it gets even weirder than that. All of this leads back to feminism, as all contemporary social justice tends to. Not only does affirmative action hiring and admission techniques lead to discrimination against minorities, at least on occasion, and inspires companies to start breaking the law, at least on occasion, but even social justice proponents complain about affirmative action. I'm not making this up. I have seen more than one black male social justice advocate complain about how affirmative action mainly only really benefits white women, including Gazi Kotzo, though I forget the exact video. But he's not the only person who complains about it. And really, though I am somewhat skeptical that white women are the sole beneficiary of affirmative action, I am willing to guess that it's rather true that it is, in fact, mainly women in general that end up benefiting from affirmative action quotas. The obvious piece of evidence for this would be that young women outweigh young men on university campuses by about 60 women to every 40 young men. But even further than that, has anybody ever really looked at the big advocates for affirmative action and who they tend to be? I mean, aside from James Damore getting fired by speaking honestly about gender differences on a biological level, which is telling by itself, let's look at people like Shanta Driver, for example, who started the political activist cult named BAM, or By Any Means Necessary, which Yvette Falarca is a high-ranking member of, due to her fears that getting rid of affirmative action in California would make it so that minorities never got into college or hired again ever, or something. That's why Shanta Driver started BAM. And we all know that BAM is an obvious intersectional feminist cult. Honestly, I'll level with you guys. As much as it pains me to admit it, I used to advocate for affirmative action because I saw it as helpful and I believed the notion about it only being used in cases of absolute or relative ties between applicants. But honestly, that's just not what's going on. Believing that is about as naive as believing that feminism is just about equality because my dictionary. In the current year, it seems blatantly obvious to anybody that looks into the details of how this stuff pans out that affirmative action is just a tactic of Marxist strong-arming implemented most commonly by forceful intimidation from intersectional feminists who believe ultimately in communism as their end goal. These people will never be happy, not because racial groups will never someday blend and be rather indistinguishable, because that might legitimately happen someday in the future. However, the intersectionals will never be happy because the starting point in their belief system is feminism, which demands absolute equality between men and women, made possible by way of the feminist women ordering the men around and making everything equal in the exact way that the feminist women want things to be. This type of supposed equality cannot and will not ever exist because men and women are different. They make different choices, and these people are unhappy about that reality. So they will lie about what affirmative action actually is, what it does, and even break the law to try to achieve equity. It was a failed experiment. The end.